What makes a perfect adaptation? The general consensus seems to boil down to how many manga panels found their way into the anime shot for shot. But adaptation does not have to mean one-to-one translation. How does it capture the spirit of the original? How is the narrative and style explored in a new medium? By definition, an adaptation is transformative. Even if it uses the source in place of storyboards, moving from one medium to the next necessitates leaving behind the features unique to the original and adding those new to the latter. The great adaptations know how best to account for that change, making use of the tools of a new medium to bring it to life in a way only it can. That's not to say one-to-one adaptation can't work. Great storytelling can transcend medium, and the stylistic similarities of anime and manga in particular make them well suited for it. But lamenting changes to the source simply because they're changes lacks all nuance. Typically, these complaints are about narrative and structure. They cut a scene, changed a line of dialogue, switched the order of events, etc. Before dismissing such changes wholesale, ask, what does the original convey? What does the anime in its place? And how does that work within the context of each individual story? Some things only work because of their medium. Hyper-detailed artwork may not translate well to motion. Kentaro Miura's art in Berserk has proven notoriously difficult to adapt. Some manga rely heavily on comic structure. I can't imagine what an Oyasumi Punpun anime would look like. Others build their impactful aesthetic through monochrome. Junji Ito comes to mind. Be it movement, coloration, or even sound, they don't just cope without these elements, it's why they work. Haruko Ichikawa's Houseki no Kuni, or Land of the Lustrous, is a brilliant example of a manga utilizing its medium to the fullest extent. She draws beauty even out of the simplest shapes. With clever implementation of symmetry, the two-tone color, and panel composition, she creates a style so unique to manga that it's hard to imagine how it could be brought to anime. Yet somehow, it was. Houseki no Kuni's anime represents the perfect adaptation. Not trying to replicate the source, rather taking a route distinct to its medium to convey the source's spirit. Let's dive into how both works, manga and anime, make stunning use of their respective mediums to produce such innovative aesthetics. When I draw, I pour my soul into the gem's dazzling looks. Haruko Ichikawa. Basing a manga on gemstones whose most notable feature is their color may seem like a foolish idea. After all, Ichikawa said the beautiful color of phosphophylite first drew her to the rare mineral as the protagonist of her story. How could she translate that brilliance to grayscale? Ichikawa uses monochrome to elevate her artwork, from the character art to the emotional weight of a scene. The gems themselves look gleaming. The often intricate shading of their hair gives the effect of their vibrant color, contrasting the solid color uniforms to stand out across the page. The cross-sections, when the gems are broken, burst with sparkle. See Diamond's introduction in Chapter 3. Their shimmer feels almost blinding. The detail in the gradient and shadowing of the character art can be so complex, from the unnerving texture of Cinnabar's mercury to the striking patterns of Voss's alloy and Padparadsha's hair. Ichikawa uses that detail to craft some of the more impactful panels, isolating these highly realized figures over empty or limited backgrounds in moments of emotional stress. But as much as the character art shines, much of Houseki's most beautiful art comes from its landscapes and interior shots. Be it ornate line work, like in this full-page panorama of the ocean, or more abstract scenery that conveys the psyche of its characters. The interiors use the long, harsh lines of the academy itself to create a sense of scale and aesthetically fascinating architecture. It's no wonder Ichikawa once wanted to be an industrial designer. Her eye for symmetry and shape in the building structure really jumps out. A perfect example of how her art isn't always about complexity, rather drawing beauty from simplicity. Many of Houseki's most striking panels use relatively basic structure and shapes. Ichikawa has such strong aesthetic sense. From the monochrome to her repeated use of symmetry, the composition makes it pop. This panel, at the start of Chapter 2, paints the interior of the academy completely in black, the lattice window structure providing a stark contrast with the bright exterior. Voss too is cloaked in black, framing them stuck inside, much as they've hit a wall with their natural history assignment. Or look at the opening shot of Chapter 13. The lines of the archways behind Voss, and the vertical line of symmetry down the middle of the panel converging around them, as they try to recollect their lost memory. For perhaps the clearest showcase of this, look at the numerous panels of the gems preparing for battle as the Lunarians emerge in the distance. See how the lines of symmetry connect the Lunarians to the gems, setting the stage for this upcoming battle. The harsh black of the sunspot contrasts the bright, empty sky, as a gem stands centered beneath them, the hillside almost pointing directly towards them. See our first shot of them in Volume 1, or this panel of the Amethyst twins from Volume 2. So much of Houseki has this vertical symmetry running through it. For a series about gemstones and crystalline structures, this natural balance feels right. Ichikawa doesn't just use symmetry within panels, she adds it across entire pages. Let's look at a couple sequences that put a number of these features together to further the narrative as much as the aesthetic. In Daya's fight from Chapter 3, take note of this panel where Daya prepares to deflect the Lunarians' attack with their new technique. The solid black background underneath the arrows forms a sort of shield separating them from Daya. Later, as the fight turns, however, we see a nearly identical shot after Daya has lost their blade. With no way to defend themselves, the panel is instead all white. Nothing stands between Daya and the Lunarians' attack. In Chapter 22, Foss battles the Lunarians in spring, hoping to show off their new power. Note the symmetry of the page. It's a reverse of those earlier shots. The sunspot in the bottom middle panel is white cast in a dark sky, while Foss in the top panel stands above it. The text boxes in the lower half drift lazily downward, cutting across what should be a tense shot. On the ensuing page in the background, the Amethyst twins face the sunspot in a mirror image of the earlier panel from Volume 1. The page itself again has that symmetry running through the center, except for Foss, standing off-angle in the foreground of the top panel. This endless fighting has become almost mundane to them, no longer the anxious encounters from before, reflected here in their framing. Furthermore, earlier on page 36, notice how the lines of the Academy in the background of Foss's panel run almost perpendicular to those in Euclase and Jade's, adding to this feeling of Foss breaking into a separate state of mind from the other gems. Ichikawa has such an intelligent understanding of panel and page composition in manga, recognizing how our eyes take in the page all at once, outside of what we specifically focus in on, and building the pages to work both as individual parts and a cohesive whole. Let's trace the eye movement through a few pages to see how she structures this visual storytelling. You can see it in individual panels, like here in Chapter 1. The panel first draws our eye to the text box in the upper corner, all living creatures, and Foss in the air, followed by their reflection in the water, and lastly the text box to the bottom left, escaped to the ocean. Or she designs it across entire pages, like this sequence at the end of Chapter 5. The gradient in the first panel fades to black as our eye moves to the second page. On the left side, Cinnabar reaches out towards the fluttering noise of the clipboard, their connection to Foss, with the moon from the previous page on the other side. Foss is keeping Cinnabar grounded in this world. As they sit isolated in the bottom corner, the flutter carries us to the next page, where we end on this arresting wide shot of the cave, as Daya's text reminds Foss of someone out there who needs you. It can be seemingly simple maneuvers. Here in Volume 2, see how the sight lines of Foss and Ventricosus clearly establish their eye contact. Foss in the top left panel looking down at Ventricosus below, with her vision aimed back at Foss in the panel to the right, before she turns away in the next. Ichikawa even considers how the text boxes themselves function as structures of the overall page. See this from Volume 4, as Foss is literally closed in on all sides by this sobering theory about Kongo-sensei. Or here in Volume 1, when Foss is dissolved by the sea snail, as their last thought is broken into pieces cascading down across the page. The panels themselves are also cut into slivers. She makes fascinating use of panel structure. Very rarely does she break the lines of the panels, only in intense battle sequences and climactic moments. You won't find any full-page character profiles or dynamic action in the margins here. It lends to this abstract, isometric quality the manga exudes, a perfect fit. That said, the shape of the panels and the interplay between them can create some really interesting effects. Here, from the start of Chapter 14, the Lunarians in the top half actually do extend beyond the edge of the panel, a signal of their imposing strength perhaps. Below them, the text boxes split in half to mirror each other, the first from Foss's POV and the second looking at them, creating a perfect symmetry to the page extremely common to the Amethyst twins material. Sometimes Ichikawa cuts a single panel into two to create a pause during major moments. See this page from Volume 2. While it's actually a continuous piece of art, the panel division splits Ventricosus's line, inducing the slightest break in our reading of it to really drive home the weight of this revelation. Finally, she considers how best to use the page itself to pause for effect. Don't know if you know this, but manga is read. You have to turn a page, and it takes a second to do so. Many of the series' most impactful lines and frames are saved for this carryover, where you're suddenly hit with the full weight of it with no chance to take it in before, such as the final moment in Volume 3, or this sequence in Volume 2. The page-length panels guide Foss from right to left, before the page turn reveals Ventricosus's true form. Some of this may seem like Comics 101 to you, but taken together, the overall effect is enrapturing. Let's look at one last example that puts many of these properties together. By the end of Winter, Foss has changed significantly. The text in the top panel guides us across the shifting landscape it refers to, light of spring creeping back across the dark monochrome. The middle panel then brings disparate text boxes about the growth of living things together, centered between flowers and above Foss, themselves centered in the panel below, empty as they say they're scared. The ensuing page accentuates Foss's emotions, melancholy, alone, frightened, further driven home by turning the page to see "I'm scared" next to this new sunrise, as tears stream down their face below. All in all, Ichikawa is a master craftsman. Her extraordinary aesthetic sensibility not only creates a work that's beautiful to look at, but intricate and deeply impactful in its storytelling, even if subliminally. Houseki no Kuni is a showcase of the strengths of its medium, the features only manga can provide. The question remains then, if you strip those aspects away, what are you left with? How can you tell this story when so much of it is interwoven into the medium of manga? That's a challenge I might not have thought possible if I just read the manga alone, but the animation staff at Studio Orange clearly found the answer. Land of the Lustrous' appeal lies in being able to visually awe the audience, and this does so in a way that only anime can. Director Takehiko Kyogoku. With Ichikawa's art so stylistically unique from other manga, they wanted the adaptation to be similarly distinct to other anime. Kyogoku said the manga gave him the impression it'd be difficult to replicate by copying the page panel for panel, instead believing CG would better allow the creative freedom needed to capture its feel. Producer Katsuhiro Take planned to do so all along, so with the direction of the adaptation set, Take knew he wanted to hand production to Studio Orange, led by president and famed 3D animator Eiji Inamoto. At the time, Orange was still a relatively small group known mostly for outsourced CG work. After a number of co-productions with other studios, Land of the Lustrous would be their first project as lead animation studio. From the outset, the team knew the adaptation would present a number of technical challenges. If we tried to craft Pixar-level 3D, a single cut would take several days and we would never make it in time for broadcast. On the other hand, the more you try and cut corners, the more it becomes meaningless to do it in CG. So we needed to work while walking that fine line. Rather than using traditional 2D animation as a base and rigging 3D models over that, they instead started with CG and worked in the aspects better suited for 2D around that. The first challenge came in the character models. Ichikawa's art brings out the gemstone's vibrance. How do you capture that in color and motion? The appeal of the series is how beautiful the gemstones are, but gems are difficult to depict with hand-drawn animation, where you have to illustrate their translucency through color. CG's main strength here is that you can portray gems just as they are. You can see how the gems would look in a traditionally animated style, thanks to this commercial made for the manga. Without the detailed monochrome of Ichikawa's aesthetic, the sparkle just doesn't seem the same. And because the gems have the same body type, it was tailor-made for a CG project, as they essentially only had to rig one model and apply it to the entire cast. From there, they could focus on the neck up, namely, the hair. Here's where the personality of each character shines in their model. Ichikawa said the gemstone's beautiful colors first drew her to them, and the CG models allowed this vision to be fully realized. Take the bunched hair of Morganite. There's a lot of layers to the design, with each cluster having its own reflective point. They look and feel like the real thing. Each one has a distinct texture and luster true to the crystal structure of the real gem. They also had to pay special attention to the lighting coming off the gem's hair and onto their shoulders and surroundings. Many of them went through several iterations before settling on the final look, particularly Daya. They cycled through a number of styles, some staying true to the coloration of the manga's design. Ultimately, Daya's hair perfectly replicates the awe-inspiring yet fragile beauty they're supposed to represent. As important as the models themselves is how they move, often a problem with fully CG anime. You can throw the camera all over the place, but if the characters feel rigid in motion, the overall effect will be sterile. The team used the common technique of motion capture for its character acting, but its most unique aspect came in its expressions, rooted in traditional animation principles. Character designer Asako Nishida created reference sheets for the proportions and faces with a wide range of expressions. Using this as a basis for the characters, they would rig the model in 3D, then draw over the first pass in 2D, and finally mold the finished product to that guide. The result? Expressive character animation more reminiscent of 2D animated shows than CG. The voice acting also contributed to this livelier feeling, particularly Tomoyo Kurosawa's performance as Foss. Where most anime voice work is recorded after the animation process, Land of the Lustrous was pre-scored. The seiyuu performed to the animatics, or video storyboards, and then they created the CG around that. This meant a stellar performance like Kurosawa's could actually shape how the animation team crafted the character. Kurosawa-san gives off the sense that she was born to play the role. When we had auditions, she was the only one physically acting out the line without looking at the script. It's like she had become Foss right then and there. We were able to learn from that natural, effortless aspect of her portrayal. Perhaps the most obvious feature a CG production allows for is the added dimension to the camera. However, often this can devolve into an over-reliance, putting more energy into whipping the camera around than the tactile flow of its action. Land of the Lustrous attacked this by bringing in 2D action animators to draw references before constructing the CG to it, bridging the gap as much as they could. Of course, the camera does go a bit crazy, but it moves with purpose. Kyogoku trusted the expertise of Inamoto and his team. My instructions didn't amount to much. It was along the lines of, have the camera come in from the right and move to the other side, and cut it there. Of course, that was written in the storyboard as well, and before I knew it, the camera would be spinning all over the place, as they're known to do. The adaptation brings Hoseki's action sequences to life in such a distinct manner. The modeling of the Lunarians and how the gems move throughout feels so fluid. The camera follows their attacks in breathtaking fashion, and allows for some remarkable extended cuts. This fight from episode 10 with Bort has multiple shots lasting more than 15 seconds each. Later, that same episode has a one-shot action sequence with Daya lasting a full minute. You simply couldn't do that in 2D while matching all these varying perspectives. And given the unique nature of the Lunarians and Gemstones designs, it works beautifully. Overall, Hoseki makes brilliant use of its 3D space, not just in its action, but even during moments of downtime. Countless wide shots of the Academy interior and landscapes establish setting and scale. The more detailed environment compared to the manga allows them to fill the background with minor characters behind a blurred focus. The camera itself interacts with the space in interesting ways, moving between areas of the Academy without cutting away, used for both establishing shots and transitions, like this from episode 4. It often replicates Ichikawa's panel structure and traces her eye movement through clever use of basic camera techniques and depth of field. Take this from episode 1, where the vertical panel from the manga guides your eye down Foss to Kongo's hand. The anime pans the camera instead, with Kongo's hand entering the foreground and coming into focus. Or here in episode 2. In the manga, we read Daya's line, then look to Bort below, and finally Daya's blade cutting across the panel, razor edge facing Bort. The anime matches the shot using depth of field, as Daya's blade enters the foreground directly toward Bort, then turns back towards themselves. As the focus shifts, Daya's eyes are reflected in it. Sometimes characters match the placement of their text boxes from the manga. See here in episode 5, where only Rutiel's line is present in the manga panel, the anime has them enter the foreground of the shot in the same position as they deliver it in the manga. The adaptation also recaptures Ichikawa's impactful use of her page turns. Sometimes they replace it with unique transitions. Here the anime employs a shot-and-shot swipe, with Foss's new legs in the next scene wiping over the previous one, as well as a similar effect in episode 10, with Bort's hair bringing them into the scene. They also recreate how Ichikawa employs the page turn for emphasis. You can see it here in episode 2, the anime adding a shot of Bort reflected in Daya's eye, in place of the pause for effect created by the page turn in the manga. Or here in episode 8, the anime replacing this page cut to the gold alloy overtaking Foss with a POV shot, as the alloy slowly creeps over the foreground. The anime often combines these perspective shots with the camera in interesting ways, like this from episode 5. The fast-moving camera cuts through the grass to invoke Foss's movement, before leading into this match shot from the manga. There's even a couple shots directly from the eyes of the characters like gem vision, an effect well suited to 3D, as the color and depth adds a new layer. This is perhaps where the adaptation shines the most. The art design and use of lighting is simply breathtaking. Concept artist Yoichi Nishikawa heavily influenced the series' aesthetic with his beautiful hand-painted drawings of various elements of the world. Most were directly inspired by panels from the manga and found their way into the anime. But while it's one thing to have well-rigged CG over a beautiful backdrop, if they don't work together, then you've lost the shot. That's where the color palette and lighting come in. Generally, the series employs bright, vibrant hues. Pastels and the cream-colored building structures accentuate the gem's own brilliance. I love Daya's introduction in episode 1. The Academy's lights first changing to green as Foss approaches, and then the multicolored range of Daya when they enter. To replicate Ichikawa's reversal of her monochrome, the anime exchanges its palette for one much harsher, using deep reds and purples, during scenes with Cinnabar for instance. It's always aware of the light source, carefully framing shots around it. Take this from episode 9. The light behind Foss casts a shadow downward as the rays peek around them. Coupled with the framing of the shot, it emphasizes this new distance between Foss and the other gems after the long winter. It cleverly implements the passage of time into its lighting and coloration, be it time of day or the shift in seasons. They're reflected in the change of environment, not only producing this utterly breathtaking scenery, but also matching the tone of the scene. Rich reds of sunset entering the picture as a mood turns dour, or the shadows from an increasingly overcast sky emphasizing the uncertainty they're headed towards. Even the shades of the characters themselves shift depending on the time, glowing like the moon at night, or taking on a harsher color at dusk. That compositing was especially important to blending the 3D models with the 2D elements of the backgrounds. All in all, the series has such a sharp flow to it, constantly building on itself. Kyokuku said special care went into the pacing, where the reader has more control over the pace in a manga, choosing to linger on a page as long as they want. The anime's flow is strictly set for the viewer. We took steps like giving the main character more close-up shots or having them intentionally repeat more important lines. It may not seem like much, but when you watch it, you can tell which character had the most presence and what their goals are. Ichikawa's work is filled with so many impact frames that simply leave your jaw dropped, and, in its own way, the anime replicates them all. Take the rebuilding of Foss from episode 3. The manga uses a series of page-length panels slowly forming like a mold from a drip, a perfect encapsulation of its aesthetic. Meanwhile, the anime uses a dynamic 3D rendering of this liquid taking shape, an effect only possible through CG. I'd love to see what the staff do with the later manga material, some of the series' most evocative panels yet. Yes, narratively, Houseki is a fairly panel-for-panel adaptation, but had it tried to match Ichikawa's visual style in the same way, the impact would not have been the same. When you add all these components together, you have a truly unique work with one of the most beautiful aesthetics in the medium that elevates the story being told. That's why Houseki no Kuni is the perfect adaptation. The production team recognized exactly how the manga worked because of its medium, and took their own route to achieving a similar effect using the tools of theirs. Director Kyogoku said it best: "I felt we could create something that feels like nothing that's come before it." Whether animation or manga, Land of the Lustrous did just that.